KU Leuven Public Governance Institute and coordinator of Public Policy Research Center. But also, and probably the most important at the moment, is president of the International Institute of Administrative Sciences, and the most important thing, one of, if not the one, best specialist in the reform of public sector. So, Professor Bukayet, welcome, and please.
So, good morning. Of course, even in absentia, I will say good morning to Rector Pop and Mayor Bock, certainly to Dean Insea and Department Chair Nyamsu. I think it's good to be back in Cluj-Napoca. It's good to be back in Klausenburg. It's good to be back in Koloshvar. I think as IS President, I'm very proud to be part of this Transylvanian International Conference in Public Administration. Because if I read the motto of this university, Traditio Nostra Unicum Europae Virtutibus Splendid, I think it really applies not just to this conference, but certainly also to the department and the faculty. I think it's about crossroads, being on a crossroad. Cluj is at the crossroad of universities and township, science and art, service delivery and digital, and that all of that requires a governance of public and private and NGOs, a governance of hierarchies, markets and networks. And I was very happy that Rector Pop also used the word trust in his introduction. I think he talked about the importance of the department here, that they build and shape professionals. I would even go beyond that. I think this department is building social capital and is shaping trust in this community and this society here too. And I was also very happy that Mayor Bock, he mentioned the 3 T's, and I think I'd like to recommend him to shift from 3 T's to 4 T's. Talent, tolerance, technology, trust. I think we should tell him that he should add a 4th T. The trust issue is important. So it's about trusting government and governing trust. I think the trust issue has been a hot issue in the last decades, and it will remain top of the agenda for the future decades. And I will try to give an overview of scientifically based what we know, what we don't know about trust issues, and how to handle that, and how to not just observe it, but also how to see if we can affect it and how we can impact it. I think it's important for a society. I think it's perhaps the most important part of a society. It's the trust, and I will try to disentangle and unpack. I will do it in 6 points, but you will see how I will proceed. Of course, this is embedded, and trust always was on the agenda one way or another, even if it was not explicitly mentioned. And it has an interference with economic situations, societal situations. We have high level, low levels of trust. It's a dynamic issue which is fluctuating. But I think the first analytical thing is whose trust in whom? Because it's a relational concept. It's about X and Y and trust between them. And so we have been focusing a lot scientifically and also in the press and as an intuition of the trust of society in the public sector. But it's actually one part of the story. And I think we have to go beyond that. So, and I'd like to refer to this as T1, T2, and T3. And there's a T0 too, which is like the societal level. I will come back to that later on. T0 is like the embeddedness of T1, T2, and T3. T1 is what most of you are familiar with. It is the trust of society in the public sector. I think, and there are statistics on that, and I will come back to that too. But 2 and 3 are actually as important, but have been neglected and underdeveloped scientifically, but also in practice, in our thinking about trust. It's the trust of the public sector in society. And I will give some examples on that, on what that means and what that could mean. I think the empirical evidence is quite low, but there are indicators that it is fluctuating too, and there are issues which are crucial there. And T3 is also very important. It is the trust within the public sector. And here we are talking about central government and local government. Mayor Bock said, well, we hope that Bucharest will do this. You know, it's about the trust of central government and local government. It's about trust of ministries and the finance and line departments and ministries and agencies and politics and administration. It's a crucial element of trust within the public sector. And that's a crucial element, of course, for the reforms of this public sector, how to organize that and how to apply this trust. And so this public sector reform, we each time should be able to link it to trust. So the public sector reform and the societal trust in the public sector, and of course vice versa, and then within the public sector. So the question is how the interaction is happening with this reform agenda. I will come back to that too. But first T1. And T1, there are, as I said, several data sets on that. They're not all coherent. They're not always reliable. The sources are different. Surveys are not comparable. The word trust is a tricky concept, even if there are definitions. But let me give you some data. So there are actually about 6 types of data we could connect or look at if we want to have a picture of a trust levels or trust patterns in a country. We could compare the countries itself. We could compare institutions within the country. We could compare private and public. We could link satisfaction and trust. We could link outcomes and trust. We could connect reform and trust. Now I will give you some, just as indications, you know, and I'm not expanding entirely on that, but I think you are probably familiar with this kind of data. So the trust levels within country, comparing trust of society in the public sector and compare these countries. And as you see here, the picture is Sweden has the highest level and Greece has the lowest level. The poor Greeks. Any Greeks in the room? Yes, I mean, I always feel very sorry when I have to present this, but Greece is not always in good shape. But the question is, you know, can Greece become Sweden? Because that seems what to be suggesting this by this juxtaposition of these levels here. I think comparing country levels of trust is a very tricky thing to do, because it's actually not about the absolute numbers here, it's about the dynamics of the numbers of the country in time and how that affects the whole situation. And I think it's important to see, perhaps the most important lesson to learn is that probably Swedish solutions will not necessarily apply in Greece because the trust level is different. And so therefore, I think the major lesson from this graph is to say that copy-pasting solutions from a high-level trust level country to a low-level trust level country probably will not work, and vice versa. And so this is about issues where we have to be careful. It's nice to have, but you could easily say, so what? And of course, it's not pleasant to have low trust levels, obviously. But as I said, it's about the dynamics here. We could look at trust in parliament and trust in civil service. That's another element. You have to draw the 45-degree line, of course, and to see. And we can say, in average, the trust in the civil service is higher than the trust in parliament. It's actually about trust in politicians and trust in civil servants. In liberal democracies, in general, the trust in the administration is higher than the trust in the politicians. And so when the politicians are doing civil service bashing to lower the trust of the civil service, they actually also lower the trust in themselves, because the distance almost remains the same. So by the bashing of civil service and administration, lowering that, the politicians actually are lowering the trust in themselves. And so it's a kind of vicious spiral here, which is important to know. And again, this is about how diverse is the trust in parliament and the civil service. You will notice that China and Vietnam are up there in the corner, which is an interesting position, which raises perhaps more questions than gives answers. The second is major companies and civil service. Here it shows, if you draw the 45-degree lines, that in general major companies are more trusted than the civil service. I must say, this is before the financial crisis, and of course the banks and so on certainly will have affected here, but the question is again how they interfere here. So it's an interesting thing about the trust levels within a society and how divergent or what the variance is. And I think it's an important element for the coherence of a country, and it's very important also for partnerships. Because if you have very different levels of trust in private and public, how could you then have effective partnerships between public and private? And I think that's an important element to make sure they are a bit comparable. They should not be the same, but they should be comparable in a way. Otherwise, you put pressure on the partnerships in general. This is research we've done in Leuven, a lot of research on trust. There was a time we had 3 full-time researchers only working on trust. I think it's a crucial issue. And this is about satisfaction and trust. Here you see it's based on a survey in Flanders. In general, there is more satisfaction than trust. Mm-hmm. And that, of course, raises the question of to what extent is satisfaction driving trust? The more satisfied you are with the services, perhaps the more you are trusting the services. And that's not necessarily the case. So the causality is a difficult issue here. But we have added Hirschman's classification of loyalty, exit, voice, and loyalty here. And I think, I don't know if it's a pointer, yes, the pointer here. Oh, sorry. This exit here is important. It's about people that have very low satisfaction and low trust. They get up in the morning, first thing to do is to drink a glass of vinegar. It's almost endemic. Endemically dissatisfied and endemically distrusting. 11.7% in our survey. These people are, we try to find out who are they. There is no line on income, the press they read, education, man, woman. There's only one key element. They all voted for an extreme right-wing party. This is exit. It's hooliganism, it's terrorism in some cases, it's migration, it's exit. It's vandalizing public goods, it's behaving in an incivic way. This is this group here. And the question is how to handle this. You will not get this to zero, but the question is how to know who they are and to control it. So trust research is crucial in a society. Loyalty is also varying to a certain extent. Whatever happens, people are satisfied and trusting. And that group actually was senior citizens. So one day they will die. What I'm saying is this group is probably atrophying. And the voice group is interesting too. So the voice group is important for the dynamics of change. Outcome and trust is important too. This is based on the PISA indicators here, and I used a bit of an older study because of the graph is interesting. So this is Finland here, highest outcome, highest PISA indicator, and highest trust level. It looks like a correlation here. So the question here is there high trust because there is high outcome, or is there high outcome because there is high trust? I think that's another research topic which is crucial and which has not been investigated and which requires and requests actually a research agenda which we should develop together. I'm trying to give a lot of suggestions for the students here to have topics developed. A last graph here is a New Zealand graph. They looked for the link, the reform, does it lead to increased trust? T1, this is all T1. And they suggest, yes, all reforms have increased trust. I must say, I put some question marks here, but it's interesting that they developed this rationale, this logic to say the reforms in New Zealand actually have boosted the trust of society in the public sector. I'm not going to the details of the figures, but and the graphs go down, but actually it's you have to reverse it. So going down means increased trust. So it's T2. So you see there are T1, that's it. T2, the trust of the public sector in society. I cannot provide you data. There is a rare empirical research where a survey, a T1 survey, where they just took all the civil servants out because they're citizens too, and to look at the level of these citizens / civil servants of what their trust was in the public sector. So it was a reversed type of thinking. But for the rest, it's almost empirically empty here. So we have to find out, let's say, reform indicators that this is something which is relevant and which is moving. And so when you see the citizens' charters, so the public sector develops citizens' charters, that's an indication of to say, well, there is citizens deserve a level of trust from the public sector. Otherwise, there would not be a citizens' charter. It's apostrophe S. It's the charter of the citizen. We have these movements for open and responsive and transparent governance. Why? Because the citizen should have access to information and should be able to check certain things, verify, look for things, and that's an important indicator again of this T2 relationship. There is the movement to say co-design, co-decide, co-produce, co-evaluate is important. It creates ownership by the users, by the citizens. And so again, this could be an indicator. The co-co-co-co, I call it, it could be the song of participation here. And say, well, it's important, it creates ownership. The quality models, the variety of quality models, they all have in one way or another, they take citizens as customers into account through surveys, through benchmarks, and through different types of things. But for the rest, there's not much we can empirically say on this here. And it is important, T2 is important. I always give as an example public transport. The two types, a public sector that has a high level of trust in its citizens, or a public sector that has a low level of trust in its citizens. You take the tram or the railway. You go to the counter, you buy a ticket. You go to the platform, you have to show the ticket to get to the platform. Then you have to show your ticket to get on the train. Then you're on the train, you have to show your ticket on the train. To get off the train, you have to show your ticket. To get out of the station, you have to show your ticket. To get out of the street, you have to show your ticket. That's probably a system with low level of trust. The other is open access of the station. You walk into the station, you walk into the tram, you walk in the tram, you walk off the tram, you walk outside the station. Nobody has touched you. High level of trust. I once had this student from Africa. I was teaching in Lausanne that time, and he got on the tram to go to the university, and he didn't dare to get off the tram because nobody had controlled his ticket. And he was almost panicking. He said, I don't want to be punished and sent back to my country, you know, because I violated the laws. Nobody checked my ticket. You see, it's a very important issue. And you see immediately the cost of a low trust T2 system is immense. You have to invest in inspections and inspections of inspections. You have to provide data. You have to check the data. You have audits. You have audits on audits. And all of that together. So the machinery cost is huge compared to a high level T2 country. T3 is within the public sector. And here the hypothesis we are launching is that the new public management has organized distrust within the public sector, has actively organized distrust within the public sector. There is a problem with indicators, more indicators. There is a problem with standards, more standards. There's a problem with audit, more audit. My friend Christopher Hood said one day, in London there are more auditors than taxi drivers. Sounds like a problem. And I think it's important. So I said these categories, you know, central government, local government, Ministry of Finance, line departments, ministries, agencies, politics, administration. What is the level of trust? Is it high or low? And I think it's about agencies, it's about performance management, it's about market-type mechanisms which are being organized, and it's about to what extent do you like decentralization? Does the central government trust its cities to run the system? Does Bucharest trust the cities in Romania, Cluj? You know, it's about these things here. Again, there is not much research on that. This is a bit of a complex table. This is also research. Peter Omsos made his PhD this year. This is also research from Leuven. And here I want to break through some stereotypes you may have. We have a bit the classification. Trust is good, distrust is bad. I mean, it's a bit of the two corners here of this matrix. So you have functional trust, and you have dysfunctional distrust. Distrust is functional. And of course, you have the two other corners of this matrix here, where you have functional distrust, and here, dysfunctional trust. So we have to take that into account too. So we're trying to add to the concepts to make a more qualified story here. Because this almost could be blind trust. Blind trust is dangerous. Mm-hmm. Suddenly something happens and you didn't see it coming because you trusted it would never happen. And so what we are trying to say here is that we have to have a fair picture, and the question is how the reality is mixed. So we did an empirical research on this to see where trust and distrust, how it can be combined. And so the atypical combinations are high trust, high distrust, or low trust, low distrust. Because normally it's high trust, low distrust, or low trust, high distrust. And I think if you would look at the quadrants here, then you see that there's actually 6% outside. So this space and this space is 6%. You could say, well, that's not much, but we have 8.2. We didn't want to allocate. So in general, this is, again, Flemish data within the public sector. This is within the public sector. This is T3. So I want to give two messages with this graph. Here, first, it's empirically possible to map it. It makes sense to disconnect trust and distrust. And we have to look, actually combine to that, to the atypical zones which are not empty. And if you wish to have an intuitive, there is a desperate need to have empirical research on this and to have not just surveys, but also go beyond that. So this is like, what can we describe and say? What do we think we know about trust from an empirical and scientific point of view? Now let's move one step further. And this is, how does trust work? Because why do we want to know it? I think intuitively you say, well, we first thought trust is good and distrust is bad. Well, it seems not to be the case. You know, you cannot trust blindly, so there should be a kind of interaction between trust and distrust. And the question is, how much trust and distrust do you want to have? And how can you, let's say, impact it? How can you increase or decrease trust? How can you increase or decrease distrust? How does it work? I think it's an important element to know. And there, again, it's scientifically a tough cookie. I will tell you why it's a tough cookie scientifically. It could be at the end of the pipeline. So we have inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and then trust. So in the story of education, it means, or hospitals, or police, you're doing a great job, people are satisfied, there is a healthy population, there is an educated population, there is a secure population, and therefore they trust the schools, the hospitals, and the police stations. Question mark. Our research shows clearly that if you're doing a good job, it does not necessarily lead to more trust or contain trust. If you're doing a bad job, it certainly will affect the trust. So it's asymmetrical. And I could say more about this, but and you see the arrows go in two directions. It's what I showed you with this education graph. Is it the case that because you have good outcomes of teaching, education, let's say, good outcomes of health hospitals, good outcome of police stations, that there is trust? Or is it the other way around? Because there is high trust in education, in health, and in security services, there is a higher chance to have a higher outcome. Ceteris paribus with the outputs. Given the same level of outputs, to have a higher outcome because of the higher trust. And so it's actually a reverse arrow. And again, I think we need experiments, we need research on that, but it's certainly, the two arrows are a hypothesis here. It's more a hypothetical type of thinking, and I think there's a scientific intuition that it could be like this, but it should be demonstrated. The other way is to say, oh no, it's not at the end of the pipeline, it's actually at the beginning of the pipeline. Because there is trust, we are willing to allocate resources, which then lead to activities, outputs, and outcomes. So trust is actually at the beginning of this pipeline. It's actually an element of social capital. It's actually meaning to say, I want to work in the public sector. I will be proud to work in the public sector because I trust the public sector. I am willing to pay my taxes because I trust the public sector. I'm willing to volunteer because I trust the public sector. And so it's actually a totally different logic. It's at the beginning of the pipeline. And it's a crucial element to build this trust community, to build true partnerships. And I think the story of Cluj is a clear example. That's why I said Bock should have 4 T's, not 3 T's. Trust is part of the story. If you have your co-participatory democracy, where citizens also can allocate some resources, and they want to commit themselves because they trust the system. And that's why they are loyal to the system. And they want to work for it, they want to pay the taxes, they want to volunteer, and they want to be civic. And that's at the beginning. And so if we combine it, of course, it's a more complex issue to say, well, it's circular reasoning. It's chicken and egg at the same time. It's alpha and omega. It's at the beginning and at the end of the story. And that makes it difficult from a scientific point of view to say, is it a dependent or an independent variable? I mean, that would be our translation, of course, to say that. And it's both at the same time. That's why it's rather tough to look at it. So it's a circular model. I could also, I'm almost concluding the varying trust regimes. Because, trust is different in market. So market-based trust is a different thing from hierarchy-based trust, is a different from a network-based trust. And that refers, of course, to the three major systems which Pollitt and myself have described: the neo-Weberian state, the new public governance, and the new public management system here. And so you could actually say that the neo-Weberian state, it's more based on hierarchy. So it's about rights and duties, it's about professionals which you create, it's about internal loyalty and judgments. So that's one Weberian type, so the ideal type, the ideal types of Weber. This is one idea. The second is the new public management one, of course, which has been very popular, which has been extraordinarily misleading, which in certain cases has been devastating, as I told you. So for those that think I'm an NPM person, you're absolutely wrong. So this is the market-based one, so it's about expectations, perceptions, satisfactions, trust of T1. T2 is the charters, which I mentioned, the benchmarks, the transparency. And T3 is, of course, the internal systems with auditing and contracts. And that's the base for this trust-based thinking insight. And then the third one is new public governance, which is the network-based one. T1 is the willingness for partnerships, also public-private partnerships. It's the co, as I mentioned. It's allowing volunteers for T2. For T3, it's partnerships within the public sector, because that's an important issue too. OECD always emphasizes that, to do that. So if we talk about elements of trust building and trust keeping, we actually have to take two logics into account. The two logics, and it's Martin also have referred to the appropriateness here, but it's the logic of consequences and the logic of appropriateness. And I think, in my opinion, trust is the overlapping concept between the two logics. We all know the logic of consequences is about these inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and includes all the managerial issues here to have the right consequences in the right way. But trust is part of that logic of consequences too. You should know that OECD, for a very long time, the Public Management Directorate never talked about trust. We were able in 2005 to convince them, writing a paper, to say you have to include trust in your line, in your logic line, and now it's entirely part of their logic here. So trust becomes part of the performance. So it's not performance and then you have some trust. No, trust becomes part of the performance of a system. And so that's why it becomes so essential. But it's also part of the logic of appropriateness. The appropriateness is, of course, about integrity, it's about responsive government codes of conduct, it's about issues of values, it's about culture, and trust is part of that too, a culture of trust, a culture of being responsible, a culture of being accountable, a culture of being citizen-oriented. And so trust is actually the two logics, and I think that's an important element to marry these two logics, because they are in tension. They are really, in some cases, in some countries, in serious tensions. And so that brings us to some conclusions. We don't have to necessarily maximize trust. We have to optimize it. This is not just a rhetorical sentence. To optimize means to bring it in line with the culture of the country, or the culture of the profession, or the culture of the organization. The purpose is not to maximize. We have much more trust, so we've done better. That's not necessarily the right logic here. It's about optimizing. And optimizing means here in the sociological sense that it's functional. And functional means it contributes to reaching an objective. That's the definition of functionality in the sociological. It's part of the sociological literature. And so we need this kind of functionality of the trust thinking here as a vehicle to do something else. And so it's culturally contingent. And for that purpose, we have to limit the spread between T1, T2, and T3, and we have to increase the coherence in any case. And then the levels, we have to monitor them to see what that means, especially in an international comparative research or in a policy field research. The second is, so we have to monitor short-term and long-term fluctuations. I think we will not run the country by having every 10 years a trust survey. It doesn't. It would be like every 10 years we measure the temperature, the outside temperature. It doesn't really help us a lot. In fact, I've always been pleading, and some countries have tried it but have abolished it quickly because it's a bit threatening for politicians to see. We measure actually consumer trust. So some the national banks of ministers of economy, they measure 2 weekly consumer and producer trust to see how the economy is moving. And I think we also need to measure citizen trust 2 weekly to see the small, and we've done this in Leuven again, we've done this type of, and you see it's like in the medical picture or in the earthquakes, you know, suddenly it goes up and it goes down. It really jumps up. And so the interesting question is not only that it goes up, you know, in an Olympic way or in a Himalayan way, or it goes suddenly seriously down because a crisis or whatever. But then it's interesting to see how quickly it jumps up to normal, how quickly it re-stabilizes. I think that's a very important thing, how this happens. And so we did this by correlating it to news paper articles and correlating it to events with the time, taking time lags into account to see how these fluctuations, what causes these fluctuations. And I could say more things about that, but we can do that later. So this is important, these 2 weekly. We did it with written surveys. That's another extraordinary thing. Normally the response rate would be 10–15%. But we had 65%, average 65% of people responding to the written surveys. We had open spaces too to give comments. 1/3 wrote written comments. It was amazing. We did some analysis on that. So cause and effect is important, drivers and objectives. Service delivery is necessary but not sufficient. We have to match it with regimes, trust regimes, which are based on market hierarchy or networks, because there's different types of trust. If we talk about the trustworthiness, it's based on ability, benevolence, and integrity, as we know from literature. ABI, ability, benevolence, integrity is the set here. And of course, we have to see how that affects the reforms. The last slide for the conclusions is we have to break free from an optimistic bias to say, you know, trust is good, distrust is bad. We have to have a more equilibrated vision on that. We have to look at trust and distrust. This is still a debate going on. Is it one line, you know, with trust on the one hand and distrust on the other side, or is it 2 dimensions? You know, with trust and distrust actually being 2 different dynamics with 2 different mechanisms here, which is my position, but not everybody agrees with that. And so, otherwise you have a trade-off. And the question is also the dimensions here of the trustworthiness and the boundary spanners, the role of the boundary spanners is crucial. So if I go back to the title, Trusting Government and Governing Trust, my conclusion is that we need more research on trust. Actually, each of you should have some way, a component in your institute on studying trust. We know it's important, and so we should make sure that we are not studying the things which are urgent, but the things that are important, and therefore trust should be on our agenda. Thank you very much.
But let me say, It is really wonderful and lovely to be back here in Cluj and back at Babashkolye. I guess I first met Colleen maybe 20 years ago when he was just starting out as kind of finishing his PhD, starting out as a young faculty member. And the next thing I knew, he was the department chair, still looking like he should be in undergraduate school. And then the next thing I knew, he and Emil and others were running the whole darn government and country. So it's really been fascinating and delightful to share these years and this experience, and in some ways just be in awe of all that has been achieved here. And it is certainly very, very special. Congratulate you on all of that. Although there is one thing I'm a little irritated about with Colleen, and that is, and I think this happened 2 or 3 times in the past year or two, without question, the most eloquent and certainly the most thoughtful figure in our discipline is Gert Buchert. And to be asked to follow him as a speaker 2 or 3 times in the course of a year is really, I think, unfair punishment for me. But in any event, I will add also the topic I have. I'm not quite sure if it was late at night and Colleen and I were both at different ends of the Atlantic, but had perhaps had a drink or two or something to come up with this particular topic. Innovation, governance, good or otherwise, and the building of a good society. But let's try to look at the topic a little bit. Innovation, actually, Mayor Bach provided a marvelous, in a way, kind of introduction to innovation. We can look at innovation in 2 different ways. At least from the point of view of our field, our profession. One is innovation in terms of, how we innovate in addressing how government innovates in addressing its own problems, its own ability to manage, its own ability to deal with particular issues and the like, and problems that it confronts. We can also look at the kind of innovation that government produces for society. There's a lot of literature that has been prepared. The OECD has a whole series of publications on innovation, and I can kind of sum up what they say in 3 or 4 points. That innovation, that governments must invest in building innovative capacity, that they must facilitate the free flow of knowledge, that they must create collaborative structures, and they must eliminate rules that hinder innovation. Implicit in all of this, I would argue, is sort of a suggestion that innovation is a problem for government. I would argue that if we step back a little bit, we can find that government has, in many respects, is remarkably innovative. I think and I've said this in many contexts in different situations, but I think we greatly underestimate, don't fully estimate all that is achieved by government in many respects. Particularly put it in the context of the private sector that we so glorify as producing so much for us. Depending on which study you look at, whether you, in the United States at least, whether you look at the Small Business Administration's data, or whether you look at some work that's been done by Harvard Business School, if you look at the Small Business Administration's data, 50% of us after 5 years. If you look at some Harvard Business School studies, after 6 years, it's about 75% of all of the private sector enterprises that have been established no longer exist. And we can see as we look around ourselves, these are not just your small little mom and pop businesses. A lot of the very, very major corporate enterprises in many countries find themselves in serious trouble and then sometimes going under totally. In contrast, I'd argue that what Emil Bach was talking about is a major element of government innovation, government leadership, creating the enabling environment that allows a private sector to develop and to fully flourish. And it is critical how well that enabling environment is created. For example, some years ago, the World Bank did a study in which they found that if a community did not have an adequate water system that provided pure and regularly available water, it would cost a private sector, in terms of producing products, a private sector entity, close to 10% more than it would if there was an adequate water system within the community. And I think also, when we look at the kind of innovation that is especially coming out of our local governments, at the institute I direct, we've been involved in a project with a couple of Latin American organizations looking at the issue of how you build intermediate cities. Because one of the problems, for example, that Latin America has is that their intermediate cities in many of the countries of Latin America do not attract migrants from the countryside, but large numbers of people do migrate from the countryside and create the favelas and the slums and undermine the capacity in some respects for local governments to function effectively. So one of the tasks we're exploring are what are the kind of strategies that can be pursued, and certainly Emil Bach today gave us a very good lesson in that. Certainly Cluj represents that kind of an experience. We can look at other kinds of experiences too. We talk, the UN talks about the fact that over the course of the period from 2000 to 2015, 1,200,000,000 people moved out of poverty. Well, about 800 million of those people are found in China. And what most economists, I think, have concluded that the decentralization of administrative capacity, the turning over to local governments of the capacity to really initiate and create vibrant economic activity over the course of the past 30 years or so has been central to that. One of the things people often don't recognize, we talk about the state-owned enterprises in China and what they have done or haven't done. 80% of the state-owned enterprises in China are in fact owned by subnational governments, not by the national government, and this has been a major source, I think, of the economic development of that country over the past 3 decades. And for that matter, look at another aspect of what I think is extraordinary government innovation, and I think that has something to do with the fact that we are here right now. And that was the great economic crisis of 2008, which I would argue essentially was kept from being an extraordinarily severe depression as a consequence of the relatively innovative and rapid action of 2 governments. China with its massive public works investment program. You go around China today, I mean, the amount of trains, the amount of housing, the amount of office buildings being built is absolutely incredible. And the United States, my own country, with the 2 or 3 major pieces of legislation that went through the government very quickly. The Troubled Assets Relief Program and the American Recovery and Redevelopment Act, which together invested probably a couple of $1 trillion in stimulating the economy. That represents a very, very important government innovation, which I would argue that if it didn't take place, we all would probably not be able to afford to get here for this particular event. I would argue the government, that the world would be still in a major state of depression had government not acted quickly and creatively to deal with these issues. There's also, when we talk about innovation, the kind of innovation for society that government is responsible for. I mean, again, were it not for government innovations, none of us, or government-sponsored innovation, none of us would have been able to be here. Most, the radar that the plane brought us here with, the computers that made the plane function, the composite materials that the planes are now built out of. You know, the first two are the product of British government scientists. The third one is the product of American scientists building, supporting the building of our Air Force and our Air Force planes that then spreads to the private sector for their use. My country, for example, and I gather that there was a little bit of activity in this regard here in Romania, my country has moved over the course of the past decade from being energy dependent to being an energy exporter. And that's as a result of slightly controversial, but can be effectively done, process called fracking or fractured drilling for oil, which in fact that process was initiated, the fundamental knowledge to create it was produced by 2 U.S. government scientists. The internet, a product of our defense agency research agency. I screwed up the title of the agency, but essentially, a defense, an agency that does research for the U.S. Defense Department is really the reason we can all, connect with one another through the internet. And other things, whether you're talking about medicines, the fact that, fortunately and wonderfully, people with AIDS are able to survive when 15 years ago their future was very much in doubt, is a product of government research on medicines that make that possible. Zika, the crisis, I don't know if it had much of an impact here in Romania, but certainly had a lot of impact in the United States. Again, it was government research scientists that produced the medicines to deal with that. So not only in terms of its own ability to innovate, also in terms of creating a society in which the private sector can, develop more fully. Again, an iPhone is a good example. The basic research of that comes out of research either supported, either directly carried out by government scientists or supported by scientists supported by the government. It's, someone like Steve Jobs who takes the fundamental knowledge necessary to create this thing and turns it into something that makes him one of the richest people in the world till it passed away. So I'd say I would argue there's a lot more innovation that government is responsible for than we give it credit for. And indeed, it is in that sense, some of you have probably heard me say in other contexts, that government is the most important institution of any society. It is essentially the enabling institution for all other institutions, whether it's business, or whether it's the ministry, religion, whatever other institution we have in society, only succeeds to the extent that government enables it to do so. So that turns me to the topic of governance, a somewhat not quite so positive topic. It was only 25 years ago that Francis Fukuyama wrote his book about the end of history, in which he argued that Western liberal democracy had triumphed with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the transitions in this part of the world. And not just in this part of the world, there was also in Latin America, for instance, during the course of the 1980s, most of the countries of Latin America transitioned from fairly authoritarian, in some cases very, very brutal dictatorships, horrid dictatorships, to democracy. Which makes one wonder if Western liberal institutions have triumphed. Why do we have, in what are arguably the three most important countries in international relations, in the international system, the United States, China, and Russia, why do we have presidents or leaders of each of those countries who, I think you can make a good case based on empirical evidence, are a lot more oriented towards authoritarian government than they are toward democratic government? And it's not just those three countries. I mean, you can look around Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, this part of the world, neighboring countries to Romania, and see that democratic institutions and democracy as a system of government is under considerable threat, and that democratic institutions are very, very fragile, perhaps far more fragile than we have ever recognized and acknowledged. Certainly I can tell you that I personally feel that the state of democratic institutions in the world today is probably more fragile than it's ever been since I've been alive and following these sorts of things, and I think that's a long time. I won't go into details about how long it is, but it's quite a while. So one question is, obviously, how did we get this way? How have we come to a situation? And Garrett, in his presentation, was certainly talking about some of the dimensions of that aspect. I would argue that perhaps one of the aspects of this that is most central is the growth in inequality in society over the course of the past 4 decades. Certainly, in my own country, for instance, half of the income growth that has taken place in the country since 2000 has gone to 1% of the population. The other half of the income growth gets spread among the other 99% of the population, and not even very equitably among the other 99% of the population. A large part of that goes to the 19% that are below the 1%. Try to make out this last little data point that I include. I'm not really as good on data as Gert is, so, in any event, I think, and inequality is not just an issue for the United States, it's an issue for virtually almost every part of the world. It's an issue certainly in China, it's certainly an issue in much of Latin America, it's certainly an issue in some parts of this hemisphere as well. Another factor, and one that I think also is critical and was very much tied into the kinds of things that Garrett was so eloquently talking about, is the declining trust in government, which in turn creates a situation of declining support for government. Again, taking an example from my own country, the difference in being in higher education today as opposed to when I started out 30, 40 years ago, in terms of government willingness to support higher education, is dramatically different. When I started out in higher education, the typical public university in the United States received 70% of its funding from government. I noticed the rector of the university said here they received 50% of their funding from government. In the United States today, the typical state university receives about 25 or 30% of its funding from government. And what I think strikes me as even more concerning in this regard is the extent to which in a typical state legislative body there is not the kind of support or recognition that it is the research and development activities of the university that are critical for the well-being of the state. In that sense, people here in Cluj are extraordinarily fortunate about the kind of relationship that exists between the university and the community. I would mention, Garrett mentioned a little bit about some of the different responses that are emerging with regard to the issue of trust and lack of trust in some places. Some of these are good, some of these are bad. I mean, I share Garrett's feeling that we all went down a very bad path as we quickly adopted the Australian and New Zealand new public management approaches with Ronald Reagan and Maggie Thatcher cheering this on. In that sense, I'd also argue that too often, and we don't acknowledge this, too often our movements in public administration are really driven by the external forces. I mean, the new public management was not a product of, Bob Ben or, various Steve Kellman or whatever. The new public management is really a product of Maggie Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and the kind of political environment within which we as scholars function, and how that political environment shapes our thinking and shapes our behavior, shapes our research in ways that often we don't acknowledge and don't even recognize. Another kind of aspect of this, again, where I think forces outside of us now, kind of the rage is for cooperative government, collaborative government, cooperative service delivery, et cetera, essentially that was all being pushed by the World Bank and the United Nations and the various development banks 25 years ago. And they were the ones who, as much as anything, we talk today about governance rather than government. Much of that came out of the urging, the proselytizing, and in some cases the imposing on countries of policies working in this direction by the large international organizations, and I'm not totally sure it was a very good thing. I mean, part of the reason I think that we have seen the undermining of government and the denial of the importance of government is because many of these international organizations, in some cases with some legitimacy, fearing that governments were considerably more corrupt than non-governmental organizations, have pushed the notions of cooperative governance and the like. Well, turning to the final topic, building a good society, in a sense, what can we do about all of this? What can we do to strengthen democratic institutions? Well, I would argue, for one thing, as a field, we need to start paying attention to them and start making them at the center of our concerns, our research concerns, our teaching concerns, and the like. I asked a research assistant of mine to go through all of the issues of public administration review since 2000. And I gave her 5 keywords that I wanted her to check how many times she found these words in the title of public administration review articles. The words were inequality, democracy, motivation, performance, management. And the results: 136 mentions of management, 121 mentions of performance, 38 mentions of motivation, 19 of democracy, and 2 of inequality. I mean, I would argue that inequality is the most central issue of our times. It is the issue that has, I think, undermined, really. I've railed against, and I certainly share Gert's views about politicians bashing government and the like, and I think that is a critical variable that has contributed in very negative ways to where we've gotten at this point. But I would argue that even more serious and more severely problematic is the fact that we have paid no real attention to the issue of inequality. And it's not just the issue, not just popularizing the issue, but so many of our public policies, I can't speak for Europe, maybe Europe is a little more enlightened than the United States, but so many of our public policies in the United States that we think are designed to help people in the middle class, people in low incomes, are so counterproductive. When our governments lean on public employees and reduce their pension benefits, make them pay more for their health care costs and the like, what are you doing? You're essentially eroding the middle class. What are public employees? They're a very central part of the middle class of any given society. And as you undermine their financial ability, you undermine the possibilities for demand to be in the society and for the society to prosper. An additional point that I would make is that we need to figure out, and I don't know how we're going to do it, and people have been worrying about this for 50 years now, but somehow or another we do need to reinvigorate our political parties. I mean, one of the things that has led us to the point we are in my country is the fact that the Republican Party had become so weak as an organization that it was actually able to be captured and taken over by an outsider. And I think this is the first time, really, you can find lots of instances where insurgents within a political party are able to mobilize forces, create coalitions, and ultimately emerge over the party establishment. But this is really the first time that someone, I think, in our history has come from totally outside the political party and captured it. And we have problems, and again, here I'll be a little American focused, but we have problems on both of our parties. The Democratic Party is weak and incompetent, and the Republican Party is totally amoral. And the combination of the two is not a good one, to say the least. And this is not just a U.S. experience. I mean, France has a president who created his own political party and beat all the established political parties. So this is another point I would make, and this is an area where I think we in public administration can and should make a difference, is encouraging our students, and especially our best students, to go into government. I mean, we talk in the United States, especially when deans and directors get together about everybody's going into nonprofits, so we need to create new programs in nonprofit or not, or create new programs in nonprofit management, et cetera, et cetera. My reaction is, no, we don't. We need to get those students to go into government where they need to be. Because again, I would argue, and again, here I'm being very American in this presentation, but I mean, there is, in my judgment, no question that the quality of individuals in our government has declined dramatically over the course of the past 40 years. Our current political leadership, I mean, I would argue, can't hold a candle. Mitch McConnell, who's the leader of the Senate, as opposed to an Everett Dirksen, who may have had a funny voice, but was actually a distinguished leader of the Republican Party. And I think, you know, I won't for this audience, but I could go through a whole list of comparisons of leaders today in our Congress as opposed to leaders of 30 or 40 years ago. Finally, to get directly to the question of building a good society, I would say that, and I think I'll make this point and stop, but I mean, and this gives me an opportunity to put in a plug for something I've been working on lately, and that is we need to educate our students more to the ways in which we can work to build a better society. And some of that, I think, I've spoken to, getting them to focusing more of our attention on democracy and democratic institutions, their fragility, getting our students to understand better the implications of many of the policies which really have counter-equalitarian impacts when we think they are having redistributive impacts. But another thing, obviously, is we do have a major initiative that has been established by the United Nations and by all of the presidents of the countries of the world meeting at the United Nations, and that is the Sustainable Development Goals. And it would seem to me that one of the things that we as public administration faculty and as educators ought to commit ourselves to is to making our students aware of these goals and the significance of their implementation and how they might be most effectively implemented. The UN did start with the Millennium Development Goals in 2000. Those were very significant, and did produce some benefits, but not nearly what they could have, for the simple reason that they really weren't well enough known. I mean, there's very little public awareness of them. Most local governments were not engaged. National governments, actually, there's been some research that I've been involved in, that most national governments, it took them 10 or 12 years to really connect the Millennium Development Goals with their own policies and practices. Well, that is, I think things are a little better in that regard this time around, because many of the countries are using the institutional architecture and frameworks that they created for the Millennium Development Goals to begin addressing the Sustainable Development Goals. But that doesn't deny that one of the big problems with the Sustainable Development Goals was the fact that most subnational governments simply were not engaged in any efforts to implement them, and the public itself, in most cases, was simply not aware of them. So I would simply argue that, for the future, we need to commit ourselves to helping our students better understand the importance of democratic institutions and how you sustain those, better understanding of public policy and their implications of many public policies, and certainly encouraging, I would argue that, you know, every introduction to PA course ought to have a lecture or two at least on the Sustainable Development Goals as a way to encourage our students to, you know, to have a realization of them and the importance of their implementation, and the fact that if we do implement them in an effective way all over the world, we then really will build a good society. So thank you very much.
I have a question for Darren about the trust presentation. The most recent, I think one of the more recent Nobel Prize winners in economics is focused on behavioral economics and the importance of nudge, and Cass Sunstein's focused on that as well. I wonder if you could speak to how that can be used both to help public servants trust citizens, because, for example, where you sign a tax form makes a difference in how trustworthy you can be, or you can expect a taxpayer to be. And then the other way around, how those principles might be able to help citizens have more confidence in their government. So I'm interested in whether you thought about that particular movement, intellectual movement.
Maybe we could collect several and you answer. Somebody else? Yes.
In the context, especially of T2,
Yeah, you have to introduce yourself.
Katalin Wilful, Faculty of Public Administration in the Academy of Economic Studies, Bucharest.
Okay.
Yeah. So, especially in the context of T2, how would you go about building a trust culture, you know, like, or a trust society, if you could do that?
Okay, Maria Aristigueta from University of Delaware.
Yeah, thank you. My question is regarding the low trust, low satisfaction. You mentioned there that these were extreme right wing. Was the commonality in those groups? I was wondering if extreme is the key word as opposed to right wing. Did you measure for extremism of any type? Whether it's left wing or right wing?
Okay. Anyone else?
My name is Raj Baram from Journalism Department regarding T1 about the trust. Belgium somehow tried to offer particular to Puigdemont from Catalonia, so it's not any trust in Spanish government, Spanish law, something like this.
This is a political question.
You see, they are there.
Okay, anyone else?
They do take this seriously.
Okay, so we'll stay with this one. Please.
Thank you. The first question on the behavioral economics and the nudging. We just had finished a research project on trust within the judicial, so it's actually T3, within the judicial. So it is really between judges, prosecutors, police services, and all of that together. One of the major conclusions of that research, I will summarize it quickly, is as follows. It's about exchanging information, which is a crucial thing within the judicial, but we can extrapolate it to other fields too. And you have three types of information. It's to compulsory information, to share information in a compulsory way, so that's the first thing. The second is voluntary, optional things to share, and information forbidden to share. You really have these three things, and I think it applies to the whole public sector. What we found is that the base, so the trustworthiness and the interaction of the sharing of the information as a test for the trust level, that for the compulsory information to share is based on ability, the voluntary optional is on benevolence, and the forbidden, because it happens to share forbidden information to share, is based on integrity. It's a very interesting conclusion, I think, and so if we talk about the nudging issue and the behavioral, because it's about behavior of people to say, is there trustworthiness in the other party, you know, the vis-a-vis here. I think by creating a transparent exchange of information to say, well, of course, it's forbidden to share information that is forbidden to share. However, it still happens, but the base is integrity. To share that is an important thing to do. The other side is the transparency side. And when in some countries, in China, for example, I was once asked the question, is transparency going to increase trust? And again, transparency and a culture of transparency, the nudging could help there to say, well, why don't you say this since all the others say it? That's nudging. You know? And then you feel guilty, why didn't I tell it? So I immediately put all my cards on the table. And so the question of transparency and trust is a very clear one. We cannot say, of course, it can increase trust and it can increase distrust, depends on what the object is to share, but you can actually push people and organizations to say, all the others give the information, why don't you give this here? So I think the nudging is a clear element in the whole picture because it's about affecting behavior of relationships. So that's it. The second thing is on well, you referred to T2 on the trust society. I think you have to walk your talk. I think that's the most important thing. You cannot say as a public sector to say, I want you to trust me, but God forbid, I don't trust you, right? So that's actually in a rhetorical way. I'm overstating this, but in fact the behavior is like this, you know, to say, please trust me, but please understand, I can't trust you, right? So, and I think it's about a kind of interaction, and partnerships, of course, can help here. So you can practice relationships, even if it's living apart together, in a way, public-private partnerships, to say, well, I think we are trustworthy, both sides are trustworthy, and I think by investing in partnerships, by investing, for example, if the public sector invests in the governance systems of NGOs and the private sector, because that's important, if you want to create sustainable partnerships, you have to have governance systems which talk to one another and which have a comparative quality in the assessment of the governance systems. And so it's very important, supposing that the government has a good governance system, question mark, but that there is a policy to invest in the quality of the governance of NGOs and the private sector to be able to have sustainable partnerships. That would be a very concrete measure to take. On the extreme part, actually, I said extreme right-wing parties. In theory, we only recently have an extreme left-wing party, so at that time it didn't make sense to ask the question, but we just asked for which party are you voting, and so they were all voting for an extreme right-wing racist party. So that happened because there is no, at that moment there was no extreme left-wing party. We now in the Walloon, we now have kind of a left-wing party which is actually Leninist and which has some success. Can you believe it? It's in principle, I think extremism, whether it's right-wing or left-wing, there's extrême se touche, as we say in French. So the extremes touch one another, and so in principle, I think the low satisfaction, low distrust, whether it's left extremists or right-wing extremists, probably doesn't make a difference. But we cannot tell it from that study because we didn't have an object there. And the question on Catalonia, well, of course, I'm not a member of the Belgian government. So that's the first thing, communication, I want to say. It's an interesting case and a test for the legal issues in Europe.
where we should not, since sometimes, you know, in a kind of neo-colonial way, we preach still to the others outside Europe what they have to do, and I think we should be modest here. I think the issue for Spain to be trusted as a state of law is important. As Alan said, we should not underestimate the fragility of our systems in some cases. So we have to be careful not to pretend that we are so solid that nothing can happen on that side. Actually, the convention which allows to recognize, to give asylum to citizens of the European Union. At that time, the Belgian government took the position to say we should keep an option open that it could be possible to give asylum to members, to citizens of the European Union, within the European Union. Because we cannot assume that at all times, in all places, there is a guaranteed state of law. You see, I'm talking at a very high level now, but I think some will think not just of Spain in this case here. I'm not going to mention countries. But I think in the European Union, we have to be careful and monitor this. So the Minister-President of Catalonia, the ex-Minister-President of Catalonia, is in Belgium. He still didn't request for asylum. The lawyer is a specialist in these matters. There are 9 reasons why you can get asylum. So exceptions. There are 9 exceptions in the convention to get asylum. One of them is that a fair trial cannot be guaranteed, and so that's the issue here. So from that point of view, I think we all have an interest to see how this case will be developed. So I can only give that answer. It's a legal technique. I'm not a lawyer, but that's the only technical answer I can give. And I think it's important for all of us to make sure that we can trust the state of law of our system. I think it's very important for the legitimacy of the European Union. I hope that's an insufficient answer, but I cannot go further.
I would just make one comment or one caveat about I have very serious concerns about the emphasis on partnerships. I mean, I really think we are in the process of undermining government capacity and government legitimacy. And I think the consequences of that for our societies are going to be profound. Too often, I think, in the partnerships that governments create, they are being taken advantage of. You know, these are ways to manipulate the system, often to create, wealth for the 1% or the 10%, whichever, and to undermine the middle class. I mean, too often, non-governmental organizations and especially private sector, when American universities, as many of them have contracted out with private sector firms to take care of some basic aspects, whether it's cleaning the rooms or handling the lunches and the meals and that sort of stuff. What these private sector firms are doing is hiring people at very low labor, very low salaries, providing them with no benefits, and it gets back to the point that I made a little bit ago. That is a marvelous formula for undermining the middle class, which in turn is a marvelous formula for undermining democratic institutions, which is a marvelous formula for moving us back to authoritarian societies.
Thank you very much. There was, as we expected actually, excellent presentation. We will talk to the mayor and add the 40. You're right. Development of a community should be related to trust for sure, and that's an excellent suggestion. And also I think that we should send more of our students to the government and help the government, because we are seeing that here some of the best of our students goes usually now on the private or non-profit sector, and that's a huge problem. Going back to trust, I'd like to say that that's an issue that we tested here, but we tested by building the institution, and it was only possible through the years based on trust of different people. Because you know, institutions don't talk to institutions, never. Only people talk to people and build trust. And I would like to mention some institutional partners that did that possible, like Professor Hamlin from MSU, working with us for a long time, doesn't matter. Stephanie Lindquist, we met her when she was dean at the University of Georgia, but now she's vice president of Arizona State, and we developed this long time cooperation. Diana Janku, Dean of School of Public Administration in National University of Public Administration and Politics in Bucharest. Maria Aristigueta, who came here quite a long time ago, and she's keep coming back, and University of Delaware. Should I say Biden Institute? She's coordinating one of the most fascinating institutes in the US now, the Biden Institute, and quite the job she's doing there. Tudor Vlad is not here now, he left, but he's coming back. He used to be a professor in this school, the head of journalism, became the head of Koch Center, Journalist Center in University of Georgia, so quite a spectacular trip. Professor Arno Lesner, also quite a while ago, he came to Cluj with an institution, international institution, and since then keep coming back, and that's great, you know, with students, a lot of students, and you'll hear about this. Juraj Nemek, which is also the president of NISPASI, and fortunately this year NISPASI is going to be held in Romania, in Iași, and I hope that a lot of Romanian universities will be a part of this, because it's very, very important for us. Of course, I should mention two of my best friends in life, you know, which are together. If we would have been in other conference, there would be the three of us there, but we are like a magic trio. Marius Profiroiu, the Vice Rector of University of Academic Science in Bucharest, of Economic Science in Bucharest, used to be the Dean of the PA School for a long time, and long time partner. Professor Marian Preda used to be the Dean of Sociology, University of Bucharest, now he's the President of the Senate, and we're working together for such a long time in such a good way. So I'm sorry I cannot be here. Also, I would like to mention Professor Papup, the Dean of the School of Public Administration in University of Bucharest, also a good partner with us. Rector Laszlo Vas, Rector of the Metropolitan University in Budapest. I mean, keep working with us for a long time and keep coming back, and I hope that you will do that, because we're trying to develop a serious undergraduate and graduate Hungarian program here in Cluj. And that's important. Claudia Petrescu, head of graduate school at Oakland University. You know, she keep coming back for quite a while now. Romanian by soul. We appreciate that a lot. And so many other people that help us during the time. But I just wanted to mention our institutional connections, of course, as you saw, and I mentioned at the beginning that Professor Gerd Buchayert, who started also to work with us such a long time ago and was a continuous support for this department, and Professor Rosenbaum also did that for such a long time. That was a quite interesting day.